With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. We got another one of our great Young Voices contributors. Excited about this one. This is going to be a good conversation. We're going to talk a little gas, natural gas, and things that are going on in the world. Lindsay Keiser, she's a student at the University of Michigan. She's been writing quite a bit about this in a lot of places like International Policy Digest, Detroit News. Lindsay, thank you so much for the time today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Let's start big picture because we talk about Russia's natural gas and their energy production, and we talk about the geopolitics of it. Let's get the nomenclature right for folks. Gazprom. Folks may not be familiar with it. If you watch a lot of Premier League soccer, they've got that around because they used to have a sponsorship until 2 weeks ago. So you might have seen the name Gazprom. That's what we're really talking about here, because Gazprom, that's the energy giant out of Russia. That also has all the ties with the oligarchs. That's where this whole ball of mess kind of starts, is with Gazprom. So work us through that so that we know what we're talking about here.
Yeah, certainly. You know, it's funny, Andrew, within the last maybe year and a half, Gazprom, which used to supply 35% of European natural gas throughout Europe, like not even just domestically within Russia, but throughout the whole continent. And then within the last 2 years, not only due to COVID, but also due to Gazprom's, board suggesting that they curb supply for their own benefit, it's shrunk to 17%. And so Europe is struggling to find natural gas resources because their biggest producer just sort of decided, hey, why don't we curb supply, even though we have this increased demand, because we know we can, right? Because if they're the biggest producer, people are going to pay through the nose. So yeah, and so then it comes to 2022, and Russia, Putin, very interestingly, decides to invade Ukraine, and all of a sudden, not only is the supply artificially curbed, but it's also naturally curbed because there's a war going on, and there are countries in Western Europe and Eastern Europe saying we can't take this dirty oil, right? Like from someone who is, invading a democracy. And so we've got this big energy crisis in Western Europe that started in 2020, 2021, not just due to COVID supply chain issues, but due to Russian aggression, and then really has hit now in 2022.
Now, if this was a Law and Order episode, we'd call it a theory of the case. The theory of the case being Russia has spent a lot of time. They've been pretty open about it. If you read a lot of overseas media, they were trying to make themselves sanction proof. They were really worried. They've been talking about internal controls. They've changed how they do a lot of their acquisition stuff. They knew sanctions were coming. Let's be adults here. They knew this invasion was coming long before the rest of us did. It sure looks like they artificially depressed the thing because they were scared. Like, look, the one hammer they got against us is they can cut back on our supply to them. If we cut it back ahead of time, there'll be even more of a demand. There'll be even less chance of that. That had to be the thinking there, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what's even more interesting is that President Biden released a statement, I believe on March 28th, where he was detailing how, the U.S. has responded to Russian aggression and whatnot. And he made a claim that Russia's thwarting, like Russia's entry into Ukraine was obvious, or was foreseen, I guess, by the U.S. But nothing in his, policies suggests that. Nothing in the negotiations that occurred in January between Putin and Biden, between Putin and Europe, said that anybody was expecting him to go into Ukraine. And so I find it a bit ironic that the president now will say, oh, well, we saw this coming, when nobody claimed to see this coming. And the people who did see this coming were told that they were ridiculous.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because for once it looks like, from everything we can see, our intelligence got it right. Now, to be fair here, people's like, well, why did they get this right and get everything? Well, because our entire intelligence apparatus has been pointed at Russia for 60 some years. We're actually pretty good at that one. We're well established with it. The intelligence was right, but intelligence is just that. It's a tool if you don't take anything actionable about it. And here's the bigger part of this too, for me, is we've known for decades that Putin is a bad faith actor and that they're also a massive energy producer. So even if you didn't know this exact thing for the last year or so, we've had about 9 months of this intelligence that they thought this invasion was going to come. We've known they were a bad faith actor. At some point, they were going to do this. They've held it over Germany's head before. They've held it over the EU's
Right.
head before. It's not like this is completely out of the blue, even without that piece of it, is it? Because this has been going on for decades.
Right. Yeah, certainly. And it's funny because, you know, you mentioned the sanctions. I mean, when Russia invaded Crimea back in 2014, we really increased sanctions on them. The US, before the invasion of Ukraine, the US had over 800 active, you know, sanctions, if you will, or like export or import controls placed on Russia. And all it did was strengthen Putin and strengthen his economy and strengthen his control over, you know, the Russian quote unquote democracy, in order to, you know, take better control of the economy and sort of revert to more of a command style manufacturing economy that they could use to, you know, withstand this assault that the West and the US has brought on them since they invaded Ukraine. So, I mean, yeah, this goes back at least, what is it, 8 years to Crimea, if not 60, like you said, all the way for the intelligence that we've been gathering since the Cold War.
Now, to be fair, I was one of them too. Like we knew he had the capability. We knew he has lusted over Ukraine and the other former Soviet republics to put them back in.
Right.
We know all that. Look, I was one of them too. I thought maybe this would be more brinksmanship. Maybe it would be they would try to do a soft revolution and then come in and take it over. Maybe we were just hoping against hope that he wasn't going to do a full bore invasion. So I'm not going to knock the president real big on that. However,
Sure.
now that it's here, I still find that the president is doing a lot of optics over substance, especially when it comes to the energy stuff. He was just over in Europe and he made
Right.
the announcement about natural gas. And he said, well, we're going to release 16 billion BCMs of natural gas and we're going to start exporting it. Well, that sounds great. The problem is you already told us the numbers. Europe needs 540 billion units. They're trying to replace 40% of their energy sector. That's like 6% of what they're trying to replace, not just what they need. It's a good thing. We need to export energy, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to what they really need to. There's a lot of optics. And then when you look at the actual policies here, it's not matching up on the numbers, is it?
No, it's not. And it's interesting because a lot of what the administration has supported is a push toward clean energy as the future energy, as saying, we're going to take this energy crisis, we're going to take this lack of, you know, available natural gas, and instead of opening up, tapping into more of our reserves, and even allowing, you know, the lease on public lands that we know have oil and natural gas resources beneath them, we're going to focus on implementing clean energy policy. And, you know, on the one hand, like that's fantastic, right? Like clean energy should be the future of energy policy. I think, of course, almost everybody would argue that clean energy is ideal in the long run, to help mitigate climate change. But we have people in Ukraine with no homes. We have Americans who are seeing $2 higher gas prices per gallon than they saw maybe even 2 years ago. And we have in Germany and Western Europe, Germany is paying $2.35 per liter of gas. First, that's higher than the price of gas was during the global financial crisis of 2008. Secondly, that's $8.90 a gallon. I mean, I can't imagine how Americans would react if that became our reality. But there is a huge immediate shortage of natural gas and oil. And you're right, the Biden administration has been pretty keen on using its optics and saying, oh, we're going to partner with Western Europe and bring all this natural gas and bring these energy resources over to help Ukraine. But I think it's, you know, what about helping the Americans? Our energy sector is suffering from this, and there are ways to sort of reduce our reliance on Russian energy. And part of it would be increasing, you know, US natural gas resources and availability at home.
Yeah, talking to Lindsay Keiser about gas issues around Ukraine and our own export-import capabilities. We're going to talk about our own importing and exporting but just to finish up in Europe before we come back off of Ukraine, folks probably don't realize, they understand Russia's an energy giant. Almost all those pipelines for Russia, this is why they were trying to do the Nord Stream. They were trying to cut off Ukraine and go around it. Just explain to folks the A to B part of this. We're talking about it in big picture geopolitics. I'm a logistics guy. Like, I understand stuff's got to go A to B. These pipelines out of Russia and all the other areas that they're getting their oil from the western and eastern reaches of their, you know, people don't understand how big Russia is. It's 11 time zones. All those pipelines went through Ukraine to get into Europe. It's not just that the war's in Ukraine. This is just a stopgap right in the middle of how all the energy was getting into Europe, and Europe, by their own policies, made themselves more reliant on it in the last few years than they probably should have. They're realizing it now.
Fair.
Just logistically, there's not a lot of good answers in the near-term future to fix this, is there?
No, there certainly aren't. And I think, part of it is like the Wall Street Journal reported that just last night, Russia carried out missile strikes against Ukrainian fuel depots, which simply just continues to exacerbate the fuel crisis in Ukraine and that which would serve the rest of Europe. And as much as, the US has opened all 7 ports of its liquefied natural gas, all of the ports, it takes a lot longer to ship natural gas over the Atlantic than it does to run it through a pipeline that goes straight over land from, Ukraine to Germany, to Austria, to the the rest of Western Europe. So it's funny. It has a lot more of a direct impact on Western Europe than just the country of Ukraine alone.
Yeah, talking to Lindsay Keiser, we're going to talk exactly about that infrastructure, how we ship things, how we can and can't do things, how it could be beneficial to America to export this energy, the policies that are behind that. We're going to continue with Lindsay Keiser right after this on Heard Tell. Welcome back to Heard Tell. We're having a great conversation with our friend Lindsay Keiser, talking gas, natural gas, as a matter of fact. Again, I'm a logistics and transportation guy. I like to make this stuff into A and B stuff because that's the world I lived in. It's served me well in dealing with politics because you get to cut through some of the noise. The fact of the matter is this stuff has a process to it. And it's great that the president was saying we're going to ship all this natural gas. You already touched on it, though. Now we're talking transatlantic shipping. We can do all that, but it takes time. The shipping routes and logistics that are going to take months. And like you mentioned a minute ago, let's talk infrastructure here for a minute, because we have 7 liquefied natural gas processing plants on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, for obvious reasons. Because when we're talking about pipelines in America, pipelining that stuff to the ports is the part of that you need to really export this energy. So now that we mentioned the deal for 15 billion cubic meters of gas going to Europe.
Yeah.
They want to scale that up to 50 billion by next year. But to really do stuff like that, you have to have the pipeline infrastructure and you have to have the port infrastructure. And this isn't Biden's fault because he's only been in office for years. We have neglected this kind of infrastructure for decades for various reasons, from economical to political to environmental.
Sure.
These are the things that you have to be doing all the time ahead of time, because when the crisis comes, they're years away and it could have been a solution right now, isn't it?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, you're right, of course, that the lack of pipeline infrastructure is something that has sort of dominated American energy policy since long before President Biden was in office. But it certainly doesn't help that he has fought tooth and nail to keep the Keystone XL pipeline closed. Something that a lot of, congressmen have fought to reopen, including Congressman Pete Stauber from Minnesota. And, the thing about reopening Keystone XL is that it would really improve natural gas availability in the US. And it would also help Europe avoid, supporting a brutal regime to maintain its own energy security. But yeah, it's a tough look. And it's also interesting because it goes back to this thing about optics, right? It's like, okay, so you really do want to help Western Europe get its oil and gas, imported from the US. That's fantastic. And yet you won't support the infrastructure that's necessary in order to make that pipeline, dream like a reality.
We talk about the pipelines, and I understand there's environmental concerns. But when the pipelines, though, and I know there can be leaks and things like that. The idea of the pipelines is you get it off the roads and you don't have to truck this stuff, and it flows smoother. There's environmental and in fact, the one that they were trying to put through Appalachian, that would have been carbon neutral if that's something you're really worried about, the way they had designed that one. It is more environmentally friendly. At some point, perfect becomes the enemy of the good on the environmental stuff on this stuff. with the
Right.
pipelines. And look, they just tried to they're putting one through West Virginia right now. There's parts of West Virginia I
I'm
don't want a
sure.
pipeline through because, I'm literally where I grew up. They got my hometown right now. They got them just stacked up, all the pipeline stuff. I get all that. But then the opposite side of that is we live in a globally unified world now. And yes,
Right.
when Russia invades Ukraine, now we're going to pay for it because we didn't have our other. Where do you think we find that balance? Because I don't want to blow it off because there's legitimate environmental concerns with pipelines. There's economical concerns with pipelines. But there's also this alternative of if you make yourself dependent on bad people, at some point it is going to burn you. At some point, we got to make some compromises here somewhere, don't we?
Absolutely. And I think, one funny thing that something you mentioned reminded me of is that President Biden has gone on to meet with, I believe it's Saudi officials and other officials in Middle Eastern countries about securing more oil and natural gas resources. And it sort of makes you wonder, are these the nations that we'd like to pair up with? If pairing up with Russia, right, resulted in an invasion of Ukraine, and now we want to go pair up with the Middle East, not exactly a very democratically friendly place, not exactly a place that cares a lot about the environment, historically speaking. Instead of, making sure that if we pipe this oil and gas at home, we can put on our own environmental controls, right? If we produce it at home, refine it at home, we can control the way that it would impact the environment much more than if we just buy it from somebody else. So I think it's another question that goes into understanding the balance between improving domestic energy supply or buying it elsewhere and not having that environmental burden on our own land.
See, I like the way you put it is important too, because you wrote about this when you were writing an International Policy Digest about natural gas being America's greatest weapon. Weapon's kind of an analogy there.
Right.
But it really is the case here because Putin has weaponized his energy sector. We already know the mess we've been in the Middle East for decades and decades over oil. At some point, clean energy will be weaponized by people. I fear it will be because China dominates the raw minerals that we need to make batteries for all this electrical vehicle. The idea
Absolutely.
that these things are not going to be weaponized at some point is foolish. Shouldn't we treat resources like natural gas, like the raw minerals that are needed for batteries for the EV stuff that's coming in the future?
Right.
Shouldn't we treat these things as strategically important geopolitically and not just, I think we compartmentalize this stuff too much, like, well, this is an energy issue or this is an environmental issue. Shouldn't this be more of a holistic, may not be the right term, but this stuff all goes together. Shouldn't we approach it that way so that we're seeing it in a healthier manner of like, look, we need to make a little bit of a compromise on the environmental part of this, and we're going to make a little bit of a compromise on this because we're going to keep us out of a geopolitical war. Shouldn't we be thinking about it more that way instead of just getting in our niche little policy sectors and not putting it all together into a complete picture?
Absolutely, Andrew. And it's funny, I don't think anything has made that more clear than the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that we are seeing reflected in prices for energy, to heat our homes and gasoline to power our cars. I think the fact that this is a geopolitical issue is reflected in those higher prices that Americans are paying every single day. Even though we have not sent any troops to Ukraine, we have sent limited military weaponry to Ukraine, if that, and we've sent maybe humanitarian aid. That's about it. And the president said, we aren't going to get fully involved, and yet it feels like everyone's fully involved in this crisis, just given, the skyrocketing inflation and higher prices for energy at home and for our cars. So yeah, I think it's more evident now than ever that energy, and whether it's clean, nuclear, oil, gas, even coal, it's a geopolitical issue. It's not just an environmental issue or an energy, only issue.
We've talked about the big picture, and let's take this down to the people level, the personal level. Something that I'm concerned about, and a lot of other people are, this looks like it's going to be a long war, especially with the redeployment that the Russians they're not retreating, they're redeployment, folks. Don't let anybody tell you different. This is going to be a long war. Again, this is 40% of the energy that, especially the natural gas, that Europe needs. Go look at a map. Europe is on the longitude with Maine. They're a lot more north of us. Winter is a big deal in Europe. Not to go Game of Thrones, but winter is coming. I know it's, April, but we're going to get into May, June, July, and all of a sudden you're into winter. This is going to really, one of the reasons they announced this deal with President Biden is they're trying to get this stuff online this summer because they're looking at the metrics, they're looking at the supplies, they're looking at the price of this stuff, and they're seeing winter coming. This is going to be a very ugly thing in Europe come winter if there isn't some pickup on some of these things. So we're talking about sanctions and supplies. There's a lot of people that are going to get real cold come this winter if something doesn't give. And then you're going to be into a secondary crisis of, cold elderly people, folks that don't have energy for the winter. Talk about the human aspect of this, because when we're talking big policy, sometimes we lose that. This is how people heat their homes. This is how people cook their food, especially in Europe, which is gas dominant still. Talk about that part of it, because that's what's going to be the headlines in August, September, October, when the panic sets in if we don't do something now to try to fix this, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's, I feel like I'm in a place of luxury to sit here and complain about higher gas prices and higher energy prices, but at least we still have it. It's still being, pumped into, the gas stations and pumped into our homes. But there are a lot of people in Ukraine and in the surrounding Central European regions that can't say the same, and certainly won't be able to say the same in the winter if the US doesn't increase its exports, and if we can't get this situation, well, maybe it's not our problem, but if someone can't get this situation in Ukraine under control. And I think, there's another aspect of natural gas that we haven't touched on yet, Andrew, which is that it's used to make fertilizer in a lot of instances, which of course helps grow crops. And we are currently in the US already experiencing a bit of a food shortage and higher food prices. And then globally, without having natural gas to make fertilizer, you simply just cannot grow food. And so while we may see it as higher prices in the grocery store, there are a lot of countries that rely on food exports from the US, from Russia, and from a lot of Western European nations, especially, those in like sub-Saharan Africa, that simply just will not have food if we continue to see this shutdown and lack of supply of natural gas.
Yeah, there's a great parallel with how we treat energy to how we treat in our agricultural sector too, because they're already talking about famine in Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of the subcontinent and Southeast Asia. That's where Ukraine grain goes, and Russian grain too. They outport it. That's where that goes, and it ain't going to go there. And they're talking famine. This is going to kill a lot of people. This is going to kill a lot of people that ain't going to make the news because it's not bombs. One more thing, kind of put a bow on this. We're talking to Lindsay Keiser. Great conversation on energy. You kind of touched on it, but I want to come back to it as a way to kind of surmise this conversation. People are looking at energy differently now because we have this evil, it's so clear-cut evil right in front of our faces. But we also have short attention spans. What do you think the focus should be? We've learned this with other issues. You pick whatever, whether it's social justice or diplomacy overseas or whatever. We got a short attention span. What policy things should we be hammering right now, like in the next couple of months before the election, when nothing's going to get done this fall? These are the policies we need to put in while everybody sees this clearly right in front of them. What do you think is one or two things we should really be focusing on energy-wise?
That is a great question. The first thing would probably be to ramp up domestic energy exports and also supply. There is, currently a moratorium on using public lands with energy and gas, or natural gas and oil resources. I think, and of course, that's done with sort of the climate in mind, but a problem like this, what some people have called the Third World War, right? It just seems like it's a bit more timely and impending than, our climate change crisis. So I think, increasing the amount of American natural gas supply would be first, whether it's allowing Keystone Pipeline to go back into business, providing the infrastructure funding necessary to complete all of the pipelines that, projects that were started and then abandoned by different, administrations.
Let me ask you this then real quick.
Yeah.
The thing about the public lease lands, explain that to folks real quick, because they hear that all the time. It's like, oh, drilling on public land. These leases are long-term, they're existing, they're already there, but there's two components of it, because they're there, but then they still have to be developed by the companies. But then there's still a lot of regulatory layers that the government puts on top of that. There's a big dance that goes on there. Just kind of explain that to folks real quick so they understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, like when you have like a lease to sort of get oil or natural gas out from public lands. That lease may be, very, very long, like it might be years and years long, but because different administrations have different priorities when it comes to energy, there's a lot of red tape that has to be gone through and has to be dealt with in order to actually access and tap into those reserves. And it's like every 4 to 8 years, you've got someone telling you can either tap into it or you can't, right? And that's not very sustainable. That certainly isn't helping us move toward a more effective energy supply, like regulated and consistent and sustainable energy supply. And it also doesn't help us when countries like Russia, who are huge energy suppliers and producers, decide that they just want to short shrift the rest of the world from things like energy, which as people living in the West and most of the world, like we need energy on a daily basis. We need it all the time. We need heat or we need gas. So yeah, there's definitely we need to focus a lot more on being able to tap into those reserves that we have, whether or not they're on public lands, get through that red tape that has caused years of like poor supply and confusion surrounding what we have access to and what we don't, and get energy back in the hands of Americans at a reasonable price.
Yeah, it's important what you just said there, because that's the motto for foreign policy: is you have to be consistent and coherent. Our energy policy has not been consistent and coherent, and it needs to be. Lindsay Keiser, great work today. Appreciate the conversation. We'll have you back, but until we get you back, let folks know where they can follow you, where you're writing, and your social media, so they can keep track of you until we get to talk to you again.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure speaking with you, Andrew. You're welcome to come follow me on Twitter at Keiser_Lindsay, and also on the Young Voices website. You can just search up Lindsay Keiser. But this was great.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. We will definitely have you back. Enjoy summers in Michigan, which are wonderfully pleasant because you pay for it all winter long. My old company was headquartered in Ann Arbor. Going up there in January was always fun. But Lindsay Keiser, great job today. Appreciate the conversation, and we'll talk more. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, man.